see that's my title, looking at like how political long-termism kind of manifests in a state, really, because ultimately, I mean, our kind of current political system is really, really centered kind of towards the short term. Oh my gosh, I've lost the slide. And kind of because of all these things, we kind of play into particularly in democracy, all these things kind of play into political decisions necessarily guaranteed towards the short term. So William McCaskill's got a really, really cool paper on this. So that separates into epistemic determinants, which are kind of limits on your noise, limits on your decision making. So because you don't know what's going to happen in the future, necessarily you cannot, you can't predict for it. So therefore, to some, it seems more rational to focus on a short term where you have a greater chance of knowing what's going to happen, and therefore your expected value is ostensibly higher. Then you've got motivational determinants, which, again, particularly salient in a democracy where you're playing to the media, you're playing to kind of a 24-hour news cycle, and therefore you have to remain popular for voters all the time, particularly, following up to an election cycle, and in cases where long-term policy may take away resources from kind of short-term policies that people find more popular, because people tend to favour things politically which are going to benefit them in the short term. Kind of institutional determinants as well. So politicians, of course, are only elected for, like in the UK, it's 5 years, they're only elected for a set value of time, which means that very often they can't, by the time they've kind of got something through Parliament, it fits the end of the end of their term, and it's really difficult for them to do that. And of course, you've got cognitive biases and intentional asymmetries, which are irrational, but kind of a lack of attention, I guess, towards the long term as a whole. So kind of how this relates to effective altruism. So I was thinking about this kind of in the broadest terms possible, because originally I was going to analyze all the kind of components of long-termism, but I was thinking kind of eventually I had to hone it in on kind of global problems, because ultimately kind of the main goal of effective altruism as a discipline is to figure out kind of how much you can benefit others as much as possible, and kind of the global problems I've noticed are ones that, like things like climate change, which definitely isn't a neglected issue, we're all talking about it, but these things haven't got solved, and that's because no single state can actually bring the world back on track for 1.5, because ultimately it's all of us who are contributing to those problems. So therefore, there is far less incentive for people to try and solve this issue, and therefore naturally, it doesn't get solved. And governance, I think, is particularly salient in this, because it's going to determine whether or not we survive, full stop. I mean, it's really interesting kind of interplay with science and technology, in that even though kind of we need research and development so we can have a potential to even survive on these things, ultimately, if we can't implement it, then there's no point. Like if you look at, we've got so many examples of this right now, kind of the global inequality data. So like, I mean, scientific innovation has massively improved our quality of life. We're all sitting here in really nice sanitation buildings. We've got food from all over the world. We're really privileged. But ultimately, even though that technology has been invented, other people, say in developing countries, cannot access that because of governance issues, things like colonialism in their past, kind of civil unrest, impact on that. So, I was looking kind of reforms on how to do it. I came across this beautiful paper from William McCaskill, which I think I've already mentioned, but I love it. However, I did not think much of their kind of reform proposals. So ultimately, they proposed 3 things, kind of focusing on the long-term more. So kind of in government research institutions, which, I mean, we've already got those kind of through think tanks and NGOs and things. We've got a lot of advice, we've got lots of hedge funds, we've got a lot of research going into that. And ultimately, future forecasting is becoming more and more the issue. But I think the problem is more kind of motivational rather than kind of epistemic, because even though we can never know fully, prediction technology is improving all the time. And also the second one, future assemblies. I mean, how does this work? How do you make something specifically kind of future oriented? How do you know that people are focusing on the future? So that one I really wasn't a fan of as well. And posterity impact statements, which again, whether or not they're accepted, posterity impact statements essentially kind of what businesses submit when they're kind of looking to propose something, kind of looking at kind of the long-term consequences potentially of their plan. And ultimately, whether or not the government chooses to accept that, even if it's a really bad plan, is in their control, particularly if you're a populist government who wants to kind of remove the red tape for businesses. That's going to be a massive incentive there. So ultimately, I think the biggest one is that we can't get these reforms to happen in the first place, because right now our current system is geared to war. So, oh my God, I'm running out of time. So ultimately, we need to find a way to get this done within our current system. And I was kind of looking at our kind of contemporary features of our And I narrowed down kind of 3 indicators for a country is multilateral in their long-term policy outlook. So net visual development aid, expenditure on environmental protectionism, and refugees per 1,000 people. And I did factor analysis and correlation matrix on these results to figure out kind of which institutional features correlate with these most. And as you can see, these are the results. So you've got very strong kind of correlations in terms of less regional authority, meaning that they give out more aid. So if you've got negative correlation for aid, that means they give more foreign aid to other countries, which of course is what we want. Particularly corrupt, obviously less corrupt countries tend to have percentage of GDP. This is not a full table, but so ultimately, kind of with factor analysis, you separate these into 3 things. So you've kind of got the kind of political party institutes, things like effective number of parties, direct democracy. You've got the constraints on government, and also you've got kind of socioeconomic factors which determine kind of how much there is to give in the first place. Absolutely, yes. I do think you have to look to kind of the root causes of that. Ultimately, even though a lot of effective altruism is looking into kind of science and technology aspects of that, even though, I mean, there's so much potential in that, of course, when looking kind of like carbon capture and things which can kind of reduce our carbon output without having to sacrifice as much economic things, which ultimately are going to get put into place. Really, you have to kind of look towards governance factors as why this isn't getting solved.